I never thought I'd be sitting in an FBI field office at 9 in the morning, clutching a cup of terrible coffee while staring at surveillance photos of my own mother-in-law, walking out of a pawn shop with a satisfied smile on her face. But there I was, watching Agent Rodriguez slide another photograph across the metal table, this one showing Patricia Martinez counting a stack of bills that should have been impossible for her to possess. The jewelry she'd sold wasn't just mine. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. It was evidence in a federal investigation that had been 3 years in the making. The morning everything unraveled started like any other Tuesday in Phoenix. I was rushing around our small apartment, throwing clothes into a suitcase while my husband David sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through his phone with that distant look he'd been wearing more often lately. The call had come at 6 in the morning, my sister Emma's voice shaking through the speaker, telling me that Dad had suffered a massive heart attack and was in surgery at Seattle General. I needed to get there immediately. I'm Mia Chen, and at 28, I thought I had figured out the delicate balance of being a good wife, a dedicated daughter, and somehow maintaining my own identity in between. I worked as a freelance graphic designer, which meant I could work from anywhere, a freedom that had seemed like a blessing, until that morning when it meant I could drop everything and fly across the country at a moment's notice. David and I had been married for 2 years, together for 4, and I genuinely believed we were building something solid together in the desert heat of Arizona, far from both our families and all their complicated histories. David looked up from his phone as I zipped my suitcase closed. His dark eyes, usually so warm and focused on me, seemed somehow hollow that morning. "How long do you think you'll be gone?" he asked, and something in his tone made me pause. Not concern for my father, not worry about me traveling alone during a family crisis, just a practical question about timing. "I don't know," I said, sitting on the edge of the bed to pull on my shoes. "Could be a few days, could be a week. Depends on how the surgery goes, if there are complications." I looked at him, really looked at him, and felt a flutter of something I couldn't quite name. "You could come with me, you know. Dad always liked you." He shook his head quickly. "Can't. Big project at work, deadlines. You know how it is." But I didn't know how it was, because David worked as a systems analyst for a mid-sized tech company, and in all our time together, I'd never known him to have a project so urgent it couldn't wait for a family emergency. Still, I was too worried about my father, and too rushed to catch my flight to press the issue. I kissed him goodbye at the door, a quick peck that felt more like habit than affection, and promised to call when I landed. He watched me load my suitcase into my Honda Civic from the doorway, hands shoved deep in his pockets, and I remember thinking he looked relieved rather than sad to see me go. I pushed that thought away as I drove toward Sky Harbor Airport, telling myself that people process crisis differently, that maybe David was just trying to be strong for me in his own way. The flight to Seattle was turbulent, both literally and emotionally. I spent 3 hours gripping the armrest and thinking about all the conversations I'd never had with my father, all the ways I'd let geography and marriage and the simple momentum of adult life create distance between us. My parents had divorced when I was 15, and Dad had moved to Seattle for work shortly after. We talked every few weeks, exchanged birthday cards and Christmas gifts, but somewhere along the way, we'd become polite strangers who shared DNA and fond memories of a childhood that felt like it belonged to someone else. Emma picked me up at SeaTac, her face streaked with tears and exhaustion. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. She'd been living in Seattle for 6 years. Close enough to Dad to grab dinner every Sunday, to help him with grocery shopping when his arthritis flared up, to be the daughter who stayed while I was the one who left. The guilt hit me like a physical weight as we drove through the familiar streets toward the hospital. "The surgery went well," she said, navigating traffic with the kind of aggressive efficiency that only comes from years of city living. "But it was close, Mia. Really close. The doctors said if he'd waited even another hour to call 911. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. I spent the next 4 days, essentially living at Seattle General, sleeping in uncomfortable plastic chairs and surviving on vending machine coffee and the occasional sandwich from the hospital cafeteria. Dad was stable but weak, drifting in and out of consciousness, and when he was awake he seemed genuinely surprised and pleased that I'd come so far to be there. We talked in the soft, careful way people do in hospital rooms, about safe topics like the weather and the Seahawks, chances this season, avoiding anything that might raise his blood pressure, or acknowledge how fragile this moment was. David called once each day, brief conversations where he asked about Dad's condition and told me about his day at work, but something felt off about these calls. His voice sounded strange, distracted, like he was reading from a script or talking to me while doing something else entirely. When I mentioned this to Emma, she just shrugged and said that men were weird about hospitals and medical stuff, that maybe he was just uncomfortable with the whole situation. On the fourth night, Dad finally seemed strong enough for a real conversation. Emma had gone home to shower and feed her cat, and it was just the two of us in the dimly lit room, machines beeping softly in the background. He reached for my hand with fingers that felt paper-thin and surprisingly warm. "I'm proud of you, you know," he said, his voice still rough from the breathing tube they'd removed that morning. "The way you've built a life for yourself. Found someone who loves you. Your mother and we didn't exactly set the best example for what marriage should look like." I squeezed his hand gently. "David and I are different," I said, though even as the words left my mouth, I wasn't entirely sure I believed them. "We talk things through. We don't let things build up the way you and Mom did." Dad smiled, the first real smile I'd seen from him since the heart attack. "That's good. That's what matters. Trust, communication, being honest about who you are and what you need." He paused, looking out the window at the Seattle skyline. "I never told you this, but I kept something of your grandmother's for you, her jewelry collection. I know your mother got most of the family pieces when Grandma died, but there were a few things she specifically wanted you to have." My heart skipped a beat. Grandma Chen had died when I was 22, just before David and I started dating seriously. I'd been away at college, overwhelmed with finals and job applications, and I'd barely made it home for the funeral. I remembered Mom mentioning something about jewelry, but in the chaos of grief and graduation, I'd never followed up on it. "What kind of jewelry?" I asked. "Beautiful pieces," Dad said, his eyes growing distant with memory. "Her jade bracelet, the one she wore every day. A set of pearl earrings that belonged to her mother. And the ring, the one with the fire opal that her first husband gave her before the war. She always said that ring had protected her through the worst times of her life." I felt tears prick at my eyes. I had vague memories of that bracelet, of sitting on Grandma's lap as a child and playing with the smooth green stones while she told me stories about growing up in San Francisco's Chinatown. "Where are they now?" "Safety deposit box here in Seattle," Dad said. "I kept meaning to get them to you, but you know how it is. Life gets busy, time passes faster than you think." He squeezed my hand again. "Before you go back to Phoenix, we'll go to the bank together. Those pieces should be with someone who'll appreciate them, who'll understand what they meant to her." I stayed in Seattle for 2 more days, until Dad was strong enough to be discharged and Emma could take over the daily check-ins and medication management. On my last morning, we made the trip to his bank, a small credit union in Ballard, where he'd been a member for over a decade. The safety deposit box was smaller than I'd expected, but when Dad opened it and carefully lifted out a black velvet jewelry box, my breath caught in my throat. The pieces were even more beautiful than I'd remembered or imagined. The jade bracelet caught the fluorescent light of the bank vault and seemed to glow from within. The pearl earrings were lustrous and perfectly matched, clearly antique but timelessly elegant. And the ring, Grandma's fire opal ring, was absolutely stunning. The stone itself was about the size of a dime, with flashes of orange and red and gold that seemed to dance and shift as I moved my hand. "She wanted you to know," Dad said, as I carefully placed each piece back in the box, "that these weren't just jewelry to her. They were talismans, reminders of her strength and the strength of the women who came before her. She survived the internment camps during World War II wearing that bracelet. She worked 2 jobs to put your grandfather through medical school, wearing those earrings to every job interview and important meeting. And that ring saw her through raising 4 children and starting over in a new country. I held the jewelry box against my chest, feeling the weight of history and love and responsibility. "I'll take good care of them," I promised. "I know you will," Dad said. "And someday, when you have a daughter of your own, you'll understand why it was so important to Grandma that these stay in the family." The flight back to Phoenix felt different from the trip out. I was calmer, less frantic with worry, but also carrying something new and precious. I kept the jewelry box in my carry-on bag, unwilling to risk losing it in checked luggage, and found myself opening it periodically during the flight just to look at the pieces and remember Dad's stories about Grandma's strength and resilience. David picked me up at Sky Harbor, and for the first time since I'd left, he seemed like himself again. He hugged me tightly at baggage claim, asked detailed questions about Dad's recovery, even suggested we send flowers or a care package. As we drove home through the familiar desert landscape, I felt a sense of relief and gratitude that our marriage had weathered this small test of separation and crisis. "I missed you," he said, reaching over to squeeze my hand while we sat in traffic on the 101. "The apartment felt too quiet without you." "I missed you too," I said, and I meant it. Despite the strange phone calls and his reluctance to come with me, David was still my partner. Still the person I wanted to share both good news and difficult moments with. "I have something to show you when we get home." Dad gave me some of Grandma's jewelry, pieces that have been in the family for generations. David's grip on my hand tightened slightly. "Valuable pieces?" "I don't know about value in terms of money," I said, "but they're priceless to me. The history, the family connection." I squeezed his hand back. "I can't wait to show them to you." When we got home, I was exhausted from a week of hospital chairs and worry and travel, so I decided to wait until the next morning to properly show David the jewelry. I tucked the velvet box into my sock drawer, the safest place I could think of in our small apartment, and fell into our own bed with a sense of profound relief. Tomorrow, I thought, I'd call Dad to check on his first night home. Tomorrow I'd share Grandma's treasures with my husband. Tomorrow life would return to normal. I had no idea that Patricia Martinez, David's mother, had a key to our apartment. I had no idea that she'd been coming by regularly during the week I was gone, going through our things with the systematic thoroughness of someone looking for something specific. And I certainly had no idea that for the past 3 years, she'd been running a sophisticated stolen goods operation out of her seemingly respectable home in Tempe, selling everything from electronics to jewelry to vintage collectibles through a network of pawn shops and online dealers. I woke up the next morning to David already gone for work, a note on the kitchen counter saying he'd gotten called in early for a meeting. I made coffee, called Dad to check on his first morning back home, and settled at my computer to catch up on the freelance projects I'd neglected during my family emergency. It wasn't until almost noon that I decided to properly unpack my suitcase and put away the clothes I'd been wearing for a week straight. That's when I opened my sock drawer and found it empty except for socks. At first, I thought I was confused about where I'd put the jewelry box. I searched my entire dresser, then the bedside tables, then every drawer and closet in the apartment. I looked in David's dresser, thinking maybe I'd been more tired than I remembered and had put the box there by mistake. I checked the kitchen cabinets, the bathroom vanity, even the coat closet by the front door. The jewelry box was gone. I called David at work, my hands shaking as I dialed his number. When he answered, his voice sounded normal, maybe even cheerful. "Hey babe, how's your first day back?" "David?" I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Did you move the jewelry box? The one with Grandma's pieces?" There was a pause, just a beat too long. "What jewelry box?" "The one I told you about yesterday, from Dad. I put it in my sock drawer last night and now it's gone." "Are you sure you put it there?" he asked. "Maybe you left it in your suitcase, or set it down somewhere else. You were pretty exhausted when we got home." I was already pulling my suitcase out of the closet, unzipping every compartment even though I knew the box wasn't there. "No, I'm sure. I specifically remember putting it in the sock drawer because I thought it would be safe there." "Well, it's gotta be somewhere," David said, and there was something in his tone that made my stomach clench. Not concern or sympathy, but something that sounded almost like irritation. I'm sure it'll turn up. Look, I've got to go. This meeting is starting. He hung up before I could respond, leaving me standing in our ransacked bedroom, surrounded by the contents of every drawer and cabinet I'd searched, holding my phone and trying to understand how a jewelry box could simply vanish from a locked apartment. That's when I noticed that the front door lock didn't look quite right. The metal around the deadbolt was slightly scratched, as if someone had been working on it recently. I ran my finger along the scratches, my heart pounding, and tried to remember if they'd been there before I left for Seattle. I spent the rest of the day searching every inch of the apartment again, calling David twice more, and finally driving to his office building to see if maybe he'd taken the jewelry box to work for some reason. The security guard in the lobby called up to David's floor but was told that David was in meetings all afternoon and couldn't be disturbed. By evening, when David finally came home, I was sitting at the kitchen table with a notebook where I'd written down everything I could remember about the jewelry box, every detail Dad had told me about the pieces, every moment from the time I'd brought it home until I'd discovered it missing. "Any luck finding it?" David asked, loosening his tie and heading straight for the refrigerator. "David, someone broke into our apartment," I said. "The front door lock has fresh scratches on it. Someone was here while I was gone, and they took Grandma's jewelry." He turned around slowly, a beer in his hand, and for just a moment I saw something flicker across his face. Not surprise or outrage or concern for our safety. Something that looked almost like fear. "That's a pretty big leap," he said carefully. "Maybe the scratches were already there. Maybe you just never noticed them before." I stared at him, this man I'd been married to for 2 years, and felt like I was looking at a stranger. "David, someone stole my grandmother's jewelry. Shouldn't we call the police? File a report?" "And tell them what?" he asked, sitting down across from me at the table. "That you lost a jewelry box? Do you have photos of the pieces? Appraisals? Any proof that they even existed?" The question hit me like a slap. I didn't have photos. I'd been so overwhelmed by the emotion of receiving the jewelry, so focused on Dad's stories and the family history, that I hadn't thought to document the pieces before putting them away. "My father can verify that he gave them to me," I said. "The bank has records of us accessing his safety deposit box." David nodded slowly. "That proves he gave you something. It doesn't prove what it was or what it was worth." He reached across the table and took my hand, his touch gentle but somehow cold. "Look, I know this is upsetting, but insurance isn't going to cover anything without documentation. The police aren't going to investigate a burglary without evidence that anything valuable was actually taken." I pulled my hand away. "This isn't about insurance or money, David. These were family heirlooms, pieces that connected me to my grandmother, to our family history." "I know," he said, and his voice was softer now, more like the David I'd fallen in love with. "I'm sorry. I know how much they meant to you. But getting upset isn't going to bring them back." That night I lay awake staring at the ceiling, while David slept peacefully beside me. Something was wrong, fundamentally and deeply wrong, but I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was. It wasn't just the missing jewelry, though that loss felt like a physical ache in my chest. It was David's reaction, his immediate assumption that I'd lost the pieces rather than that they'd been stolen, his strange reluctance to involve the police, the way he'd seemed more annoyed than sympathetic about the whole situation. I got up quietly and went to the living room, where I sat in the dark and tried to piece together the events of the past week. David's odd behavior during my phone calls from Seattle, his refusal to come with me for the family emergency, the scratches on the front door lock, his immediate focus on insurance and documentation, rather than the violation of our home and the loss of something irreplaceable. For the first time since I'd known him, I found myself wondering if I could trust my own husband. I met David Martinez on a humid Thursday afternoon in June, 3 years earlier, when Phoenix was already blazing at 112 degrees, and most sensible people were hiding indoors, with their air conditioners cranked to Arctic levels. I was definitely not being sensible. I was standing in the parking lot of a U-Haul rental place, sweating through my favorite sundress and seriously questioning every life decision that had led me to move to Arizona in the middle of summer. The moving truck I'd reserved online had turned out to be roughly the size of a shoebox, completely inadequate for transporting my entire life from Portland to Phoenix. I was standing there with my phone pressed to my ear, listening to a customer service representative explain that the next available truck wouldn't be ready for 3 days, when a voice behind me said, "Rough day for a move." I turned around to find a man about my age leaning against a pristine white pickup truck, wearing dark jeans and a button-down shirt that somehow managed to look crisp despite the heat. He had the kind of warm brown eyes that seemed genuinely interested in whatever you might say next, and when he smiled, laugh lines appeared at the corners that suggested he did it often. "You could say that," I replied, gesturing helplessly at the tiny truck. "Apparently, when you tell them you have a one-bedroom apartment's worth of stuff, they assume you live like a monk." He laughed, a genuine sound that made something loosen in my chest. "I'm David," he said, walking closer and extending his hand. "And unless you're planning to make 17 trips in that thing, I'd say you need some help." I shook his hand, noting that his grip was firm but not aggressive, and that he didn't hold on a second longer than necessary. "Mia, and yes, I absolutely need help, but I can't exactly ask a stranger to spend his day moving furniture." "What if the stranger offered?" David asked, tilting his head with a smile that was part amusement, part genuine concern. "I've got the truck, I've got the time, and honestly, I've got nothing better to do than rescue someone from U-Haul hell." There was something about the way he said it, without any of the aggressive helpfulness that would have made me suspicious, that made me actually consider his offer. He seemed relaxed, like helping random people move was something he did every Thursday, no big deal. "You don't even know me," I pointed out. "I could be a serial killer planning to lure you back to my apartment and murder you with a kitchen knife." "Could be," David agreed seriously. "But if you were a serial killer, would you really wear a dress that pretty to do manual labor? Seems impractical." I looked down at my sundress, which was indeed completely inappropriate for moving furniture, and started laughing. Not polite social laughter, but the kind of real, surprised laughter that happens when someone catches you off guard in the best possible way. "Fair point," I said. "Though, for all I know, you could be the serial killer here." "True," David said, pulling out his phone. "Tell you what, here's my driver's license photo, my work ID, and my LinkedIn profile. Feel free to call your mom, your best friend, and the Phoenix Police Department to verify that I'm a boring systems analyst who volunteers at animal shelters on weekends and has never been arrested for anything more serious than a parking ticket." He was joking, but he actually showed me his work ID from TechFlow Solutions, and something about his willingness to be completely transparent made my decision for me. That, and the fact that I was genuinely desperate, and he was offering exactly the kind of help I needed. 3 hours later, we'd successfully moved my entire life from a storage unit into my new apartment, a process that involved significantly more heavy lifting and strategic maneuvering than I'd anticipated. David approached the whole thing like a puzzle to be solved, figuring out how to get my grandmother's antique dresser around 2 tight corners and up a flight of stairs without scratching either the furniture or the walls. "You're really good at this," I said, watching him carefully position my bookshelf in the living room. "Do you moonlight as a professional mover?" "Nah," he said, wiping sweat from his forehead with the bottom of his shirt, a gesture that revealed a strip of tan skin that I definitely shouldn't have been noticing. "I just helped my sister move about 6 times during college. You pick up techniques." We ordered pizza afterward, sitting on my couch among boxes and eating straight from the delivery box because I hadn't unpacked plates yet. The conversation flowed easily, the kind of comfortable back and forth that usually takes weeks or months to develop with someone new. David told me about growing up in Tempe with his sister Carmen and his mother Patricia, about studying computer science at ASU because he liked solving problems but didn't want to deal with people all day. "What about you?" he asked, reaching for another slice of pizza. "What brings a nice Portland girl to the desert wasteland of Arizona?" "Job opportunity," I said, though that was only part of the truth. A marketing firm here offered me a position doing graphic design work. Better pay, better weather, chance to start over somewhere new. David nodded, but something in his expression suggested he'd heard the part one hadn't said out loud. Start over from what? I hesitated, twirling cheese around my finger and wondering how much honesty was appropriate for a first conversation. But something about David's presence felt safe, non-judgmental. So I found myself telling him about Marcus, my ex-boyfriend of 3 years, who decided 2 weeks before our planned engagement that he wanted to explore other options, and had promptly started exploring them with his coworker Sarah. Ouch, David said when I finished the story. So you packed up your entire life and moved to a different state to get away from him? Not exactly, I said, feeling defensive even though his tone wasn't critical. I got a good job offer. The fact that it happened to be 1,000 miles away from Marcus and Sarah was just a bonus. David was quiet for a moment, studying my face with those warm brown eyes. For what it's worth, he said finally, I think anyone who would let you go is probably not smart enough to deserve you in the first place. It was a simple statement, delivered without drama or obvious flattery, but something about the sincerity in his voice made my cheeks warm. You don't even know me, I said, echoing my earlier protest about the moving help. I know you're brave enough to move across the country for a fresh start, he said. I know you're organized enough to pack an entire apartment efficiently. I know you tip pizza delivery drivers well and you laugh at your own misfortune instead of feeling sorry for yourself. He paused, taking a sip of the beer we'd grabbed from my refrigerator. And I know you're kind enough to trust a stranger who offered to help, which says something about your character. I stared at him, this man who'd appeared out of nowhere, and somehow turned one of the most stressful days of my life into something that felt almost like fun. Are you always this insightful about people you've known for 4 hours? Only the interesting ones, David said with a grin that made my stomach flutter in a way I'd almost forgotten was possible. He left around 10 that night, after helping me set up my bed and making sure I had working lights in every room. At the door, he paused and pulled out his phone. I know this might be presumptuous, he said, but I was wondering if you'd like to get dinner sometime. Somewhere with actual plates and maybe air conditioning. I looked at this man who'd spent his entire afternoon helping a stranger, who'd made me laugh more in one day than I had in months, who somehow managed to be both completely genuine and subtly charming at the same time. I'd like that, I said, and meant it more than I'd expected to. Our first real date was 2 days later, at a small Italian restaurant in Scottsdale that David claimed had the best marinara sauce in the valley. He was right about the sauce, but more importantly, he was right about everything else too. The conversation over dinner was even easier than it had been over pizza boxes, ranging from childhood memories to career ambitions to completely ridiculous hypothetical questions about what superpower we'd choose and whether we'd rather fight 1 horse-sized duck or 100 duck-sized horses. Definitely the horse-sized duck, David said seriously, cutting into his chicken parmesan. You only have to defeat 1 opponent, even if it's a big one. 100 tiny attackers would be overwhelming. But think about the logistics, I argued, twirling pasta around my fork. A horse-sized duck would be terrifying. Those beaks are designed for destruction. At least with tiny ducks, you could probably just run away. David considered this, nodding thoughtfully. Valid point. Though running away from 100 angry ducks seems like it would require more cardio than I'm currently capable of. So your superpower choice would be super speed? I asked. Nah, he said, grinning. I'd go with the ability to communicate with animals. Then I could just negotiate with the ducks. Work out some kind of peace treaty. I laughed, nearly choking on my wine. You'd diplomat your way out of a duck fight? Absolutely. Violence should always be a last resort, even with waterfowl. It was ridiculous, but it was also revealing in a way that surprised me. David approached everything, even hypothetical duck battles, with the same thoughtful problem-solving approach. He looked for solutions that worked for everyone involved. He considered consequences and alternatives. He made everything seem manageable and logical without being boring. After dinner, we walked around Old Town Scottsdale, window shopping and people watching in the warm evening air. David told me stories about growing up in Arizona, about learning to appreciate the desert landscape that so many people found harsh and unwelcoming. There's beauty here, he said as we paused in front of a gallery featuring paintings of saguaro cacti and red rock formations. You just have to look for it differently than you would somewhere like Portland. It's not obvious or easy, but once you see it, really see it, it gets under your skin. I looked around at the stucco buildings and palm trees, the mountains rising dark against the star-filled sky, and tried to see it through his eyes. "Show me," I said impulsively. Over the next few weeks, David did exactly that. He took me hiking in the Superstition Mountains, where we watched the sunrise paint the rocks in shades of gold and pink that seemed too vivid to be real. He showed me hidden neighborhoods in Phoenix, where artists had transformed blank walls into murals that told stories of the city's history and culture. We spent Saturday mornings at the farmers market in central Phoenix, where David seemed to know half the vendors by name and introduced me as his friend who was new to the area and needed to understand the proper way to select a prickly pear. "The key," explained Rosa, an elderly woman who sold the most beautiful produce I'd ever seen, "is to look for deep color but not too much give when you press gently. And always, always wear gloves when you handle them fresh." David bought a bag of prickly pears and spent that afternoon teaching me how to carefully remove the spines and prepare them for eating. We made agua fresca in my blender, the bright magenta liquid tasting like nothing I'd ever experienced, sweet and slightly tart with an almost floral undertone. "It's like drinking a sunset," I said, sipping the agua fresca while sitting on my apartment balcony as the sky turned the same deep pink as the drink. "That's exactly what my grandmother used to say," David replied, and something in his voice made me look at him more carefully. "She taught me how to make this when I was 7, said it was important to know how to find sweetness in things that look dangerous from the outside." "Sounds like a wise woman," I said softly. "She was," David said, staring out at the desert landscape spreading beyond the city. "She died when I was in high school, but she taught me most of what I know about seeing beauty in unexpected places." It was the first time David had mentioned anyone in his family being gone, and I could hear the genuine love and loss in his voice. I reached over and took his hand, threading our fingers together, and for a moment we sat in comfortable silence, connected by shared understanding of how much the people we love can shape who we become. That night was the first time David kissed me, a soft, tentative brush of lips that tasted like prickly pear and possibility. We were standing on my balcony, the city lights spread out below us, and when he pulled back to look at my face, his expression was tender and slightly uncertain. "I've been wanting to do that for weeks," he admitted. "I've been wanting you to," I replied, and when he kissed me again, it was with more confidence, his hands gentle on my face, his mouth warm and sure against mine. We took things slowly after that, spending hours talking on the phone when we couldn't see each other, meeting for coffee before work, taking long drives through the desert, where David would point out different types of cacti and explain how they'd adapted to survive in such a harsh environment. He was patient with my adjustment to Arizona life, bringing me electrolyte drinks when I underestimated the heat, teaching me which neighborhoods had the best Mexican food, helping me understand that the key to desert living was working with the climate rather than fighting against it. "You don't try to make Arizona into something it's not," he explained one evening as we sat by his apartment complex pool, watching other residents float on inflatable loungers in the blue-lit water. "You adapt your schedule, your clothing, your expectations. You learn to appreciate different kinds of beauty." I was learning to appreciate different kinds of beauty, both in the landscape and in David himself. He had a quiet confidence that never tipped over into arrogance, a genuine interest in other people that made everyone from waitresses to grocery store clerks light up when they talked to him. He remembered small details about my life, asking follow-up questions about freelance projects I'd mentioned weeks earlier, bringing me coffee drinks he'd noticed I particularly enjoyed. Most importantly, David made me feel like the best version of myself. When I was with him, I was funnier, more adventurous, more willing to try new things. He encouraged my work as a graphic designer, asking thoughtful questions about my creative process, and celebrating small victories like landing new clients or completing challenging projects. He never made me feel like I needed to be different or better. He seemed genuinely delighted by who I already was. 3 months after we met, David asked me to meet his family. His sister Carmen was visiting from Tucson, where she worked as a social worker, and his mother Patricia had planned a Sunday barbecue at her house in Tempe. Fair warning, David said as we drove through Patricia's neighborhood, a well-maintained area of single-story homes with desert landscaping and tile roofs. My mom can be a little intense. She's very protective of me and Carmen, especially since Dad died when we were teenagers. She means well, but she has strong opinions about everything. What kind of strong opinions? I asked, suddenly nervous about making a good impression. Oh, you know. Traditional stuff. She thinks I should have been married years ago, that I work too much, that I don't call her often enough. David pulled into the driveway of a beige house with a perfectly manicured front yard featuring several varieties of cacti arranged in geometric patterns. She's going to love you, though. I can tell. Patricia Martinez opened the front door before we'd even knocked. A petite woman in her early 60s with salt and pepper hair pulled back in a neat bun and sharp dark eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She was wearing a floral apron over dark jeans and a white blouse, and her smile was warm but assessing as she looked me up and down. You must be Mia, she said, pulling me into a hug that smelled like vanilla and cumin. David has told me so much about you. Come in, come in. Carmen's already here, and I've made way too much food as usual. The house was immaculate, decorated in warm earth tones, with southwestern touches that managed to feel authentic rather than touristy. Family photos covered most available surfaces, and I could see David's progression from gap-toothed little boy to serious teenager to the man standing beside me, his arm casually draped around my shoulders. Carmen Martinez turned out to be a slightly more animated version of her brother, with the same warm brown eyes and easy smile but a more direct communication style. She was sitting at the kitchen island, chopping vegetables for salad, and she grinned when she saw us. Finally, she said, wiping her hands on a dish towel before coming over to hug me. I was starting to think David had made you up. He talks about you constantly but never brought you around. I wanted to make sure she'd stick around before subjecting her to you two, David said with a grin, dodging the dish towel Carmen threw at his head. The afternoon was easier than I'd expected. Patricia was indeed intense, asking detailed questions about my family background, my education, my career plans. But she did it with genuine interest rather than judgment. She seemed particularly impressed that I'd moved to Arizona by myself, nodding approvingly when I described learning to navigate the heat and finding my place in a new city. It takes courage to start over somewhere new, she said, passing me a plate loaded with perfectly seasoned carne asada, homemade tortillas and vegetables that tasted like they'd been grown in someone's backyard garden. David's father did the same thing when he came here from Mexico, left everything familiar behind to build a better life. Mom, David said quietly, a warning in his voice. What? Patricia said, looking genuinely puzzled. It's a compliment. I'm saying Mia has the same kind of strength Papa had. I felt a warm flush of pleasure at the comparison, even though I didn't know the details of David's father's story. Patricia talked about him throughout the meal, sharing memories of a man who'd worked 2 jobs to support his family, who'd insisted his children get college educations, who'd died too young in a construction accident, but had lived long enough to see David graduate from high school. He would have liked you, Patricia told me as we cleaned up after dinner, her hands busy washing dishes while David and Carmen argued about something sports-related in the living room. He always said the most important thing about a person was how they treated family, and I can see how happy you make my son. He makes me happy too, I said, drying the plate she handed me and trying not to read too much into her use of the word family. Good, Patricia said firmly. David deserves someone who appreciates him. He's always been too giving, too trusting. I worry about people taking advantage of that. There was something in her tone that made me look at her more carefully, but before I could ask what she meant, David appeared in the kitchen doorway. Everything okay in here? He asked, glancing between his mother and me with a slightly wary expression. Just getting to know your girlfriend, Patricia said with an innocent smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She's lovely, Mijo. You should bring her around more often. The drive home was quiet, both of us processing the evening. I'd enjoyed meeting David's family, but there had been undercurrents I couldn't quite identify, moments when Patricia's comments had seemed to carry more weight than their surface meaning. Your mom really loves you, I said finally as we pulled into my apartment complex. She does, David agreed. Sometimes too much. She has a hard time letting go, trusting that Carmen and I can take care of ourselves. He parked the car and turned to look at me. She liked you, though. I could tell. How could you tell? I asked, genuinely curious. She offered you seconds on dessert, David said with a grin. That's Mom's ultimate sign of approval. Plus, she didn't ask you any questions about your intentions toward her son, which means she's already decided you're good enough for me. I laughed, leaning over to kiss him softly. Lucky me. Lucky both of us, David said against my lips, and I believed him completely. Looking back now, I realized there were signs even then that Patricia Martinez was more complicated than she appeared. The way she'd ask detailed questions about my family's financial situation, disguised as casual conversation about my parents, divorce, her interest in my work schedule, how often I traveled, whether I had family nearby. The casual way she'd mentioned that David had given her a spare key to his apartment for emergencies, and her assumption that I probably had one too. But at the time, newly in love and eager to be accepted by David's family, I interpreted Patricia's curiosity as maternal protectiveness. When she started calling me directly, inviting me to lunch or shopping trips, I was flattered by the attention. When she began dropping by David's apartment unannounced, usually when he wasn't home, I assumed she was just checking on him the way mothers do. It wasn't until much later that I understood Patricia Martinez had been studying me from the very beginning, learning my habits and vulnerabilities, cataloging information she would eventually use against me. But that Sunday afternoon, sitting in her kitchen and feeling welcomed into David's family, I thought I'd found something I'd been looking for my entire life. A place where I belonged, people who wanted me to stay. I was so busy falling in love with David and the life we were building together that I never noticed his mother was falling in love with something else entirely, the idea of what I could provide for her, and how much that might be worth. The morning Patricia destroyed my world started like any other Wednesday. I woke up to David's alarm at 6:30, made coffee while he showered, and kissed him goodbye at the door while he rushed off to an early meeting with his biggest client. I had 3 freelance projects due that week, and was looking forward to a productive day of uninterrupted work. The last thing I expected was for my phone to ring at 9:15, with Patricia's name on the caller ID. Maya, honey. Her voice came through the speaker, syrupy sweet with an underlying tension I'd learned to recognize, but never quite understood. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important. Just working, I said, saving the logo design I'd been tweaking for the past hour. What's up? Well, I hate to bother you with this, but I'm having the most terrible day. My car won't start, and I have that doctor's appointment I told you about last week. The one for my blood pressure medication. I was wondering if maybe you could give me a ride? I frowned, scrolling through my mental calendar. Patricia had mentioned a doctor's appointment, but I could have sworn she'd said it was next week. Still, she sounded genuinely distressed, and she'd been having car trouble for months, constantly talking about how she needed to replace her aging Honda but couldn't afford the payments. Of course, I said, already closing my laptop. What time is your appointment? 10:30, Patricia said, relief flooding her voice. At the clinic on Baseline Road. I know it's short notice, but I tried calling David and he's not answering. Must be in one of those important meetings he can't leave. I glanced at the clock. If I left now, I could drive Patricia to her appointment, wait while she saw the doctor, drive her home, and still have most of the day left for work. It wasn't ideal, but Patricia had been nothing but kind to me for the past year and a half. She'd welcomed me into the family, included me in holiday celebrations, even given me her grandmother's recipe for tamales after I'd complimented them at Christmas dinner. I'll be there in 20 minutes, I told her. You're an angel, Patricia said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. I don't know what I'd do without you. The drive to Patricia's house gave me time to think about how much my relationship with David's mother had evolved since that first barbecue. She'd become almost like a surrogate mother to me, filling a gap I hadn't even realized existed since my parents' divorce and my father's move to Seattle. She called to check on me when I was sick, remembered my birthday with thoughtful gifts, and had started including me in family traditions like Sunday dinners and holiday celebrations. Sometimes her attention felt a little overwhelming. She had strong opinions about everything from my career choices to my wardrobe to my relationship with David, and she wasn't shy about sharing them. But I'd attributed this to cultural differences and the natural protectiveness of a mother who'd raised 2 children alone after being widowed young. Patricia was waiting on her front porch when I pulled into the driveway, dressed in a navy blue cardigan and matching slacks that made her look professional and put together despite her claims of having a terrible morning. She climbed into my passenger seat with a grateful sigh. "Thank you so much for this," she said, buckling her seatbelt. "I don't know what's wrong with that car. It was running fine yesterday, and this morning it just wouldn't turn over. Have you had it looked at recently?" I asked, backing out of the driveway and heading toward Baseline Road. "Oh, you know how it is," Patricia said with a wave of her hand. "Car repairs are so expensive, and mechanics always try to talk you into things you don't really need. I keep hoping it'll just keep running until I can save up for something newer." We chatted about inconsequential things during the drive. Patricia asked about my work, complimented the earrings I was wearing, mentioned that Carmen was thinking about moving back to Phoenix for a new job opportunity. It was the kind of comfortable conversation I'd come to expect with her, though I noticed she seemed more animated than usual, almost excited despite her supposed car troubles. The medical clinic was in a busy strip mall, surrounded by other businesses that seemed to cater to an older clientele. As I pulled into a parking space, Patricia reached over and squeezed my hand. "I really appreciate this," she said, her dark eyes intense behind her glasses. "Family helps family, right? That's what matters most." "Of course," I said, touched by the sentiment even though something about her grip on my hand felt oddly urgent. "Take your time in there. I'll just wait in the car and work on my laptop." Patricia hesitated for a moment, her hand still on mine. "Actually, would you mind coming in with me? I know it sounds silly, but I get nervous about medical appointments, especially when they're talking about changing my medications. Sometimes I forget to ask the important questions." I looked at her face, seeing genuine anxiety there, and felt a pang of sympathy. "Sure, if you want me to." "Thank you," Patricia said, releasing my hand and gathering her purse. "I know David would want someone to be there with me, and since he can't make it." The waiting room was typical of medical offices everywhere: beige walls decorated with motivational posters about healthy living, outdated magazines scattered on small tables, and the persistent smell of industrial disinfectant. Patricia checked in with the receptionist while I found 2 seats together and settled in to wait. "Mrs. Martinez," a nurse appeared in the doorway after about 15 minutes, clipboard in hand. "Dr. Ramirez will see you now." Patricia stood up, then turned to me with an expectant look. "Coming?" I followed her and the nurse down a short hallway to an examination room, feeling slightly awkward about intruding on what should have been a private medical consultation. Dr. Ramirez was a middle-aged man with a kind face and gentle manner who seemed genuinely pleased that Patricia had brought someone with her. "It's always good when patients have support," he said, shaking both our hands. "Are you Mrs. Martinez's daughter?" "Daughter-in-law," Patricia said quickly before I could correct her. "Well, soon to be. Mia is practically family already." I felt heat rise in my cheeks at the assumption, since David and I had never discussed marriage seriously, but Dr. Ramirez just nodded and began reviewing Patricia's chart. The appointment proceeded normally, with discussion of her blood pressure readings and adjustments to her medication dosage. I mostly sat quietly, occasionally taking notes when Patricia asked me to remember specific instructions about timing and side effects. It wasn't until we were walking back to the car that I realized how strange the whole situation had been. Patricia had seemed completely calm and confident during the appointment, asking informed questions and discussing her symptoms with the kind of detail that suggested she was anything but nervous about medical consultations. She'd introduced me as her daughter-in-law to a doctor I'd never met, creating an intimacy and permanence in our relationship that didn't actually exist yet. "Thank you again for coming with me," Patricia said as I started the car. "It really helped to have you there." "No problem," I said, though I was beginning to feel manipulated in a way I couldn't quite articulate. "I'm glad everything went well with your appointment." "Oh, it did," Patricia said, settling back in her seat with what looked like satisfaction. "Dr. Ramirez thinks I'm responding very well to the current treatment plan." We were halfway back to her house when Patricia suddenly straightened up and pointed to a small shopping center on our right. "Oh, would you mind making a quick stop? I just remembered I need to pick up a prescription, and there's a pharmacy right there." I pulled into the parking lot, expecting Patricia to jump out and run in quickly, but instead she turned to me with another one of her intense looks. "Would you mind coming in with me?" she asked. "I might need help carrying things, and I want to make sure I understand the pharmacist's instructions correctly." Something about the request felt off, but I couldn't think of a reasonable way to refuse. We walked into the pharmacy together, and Patricia approached the counter with confident familiarity. "I'm here to pick up for Martinez," she told the pharmacist, a young woman with bright purple hair who seemed to recognize her. "Oh, hey, Mrs. Martinez," the pharmacist said with a smile. "Give me just a second to grab your order." She disappeared into the back area, leaving Patricia and me standing at the counter. I noticed Patricia glancing around the store with what seemed like nervous energy, checking her watch and tapping her fingers against the counter. "Everything okay?" I asked. Fine, Patricia said quickly. "Just eager to get home and rest. It's been a long morning." The pharmacist returned with a small white bag, which Patricia took with a grateful smile and more thanks than seemed necessary for a routine prescription pickup. As we walked back to the car, I noticed that Patricia clutched the bag tightly against her chest, almost protectively. The drive back to her house was quieter than the trip out, with Patricia seeming lost in thought and responding to my attempts at conversation with distracted murmurs. When I pulled into her driveway, she sat for a moment without moving, staring at her front door with an expression I couldn't read. "Are you sure you're okay?" I asked, genuinely concerned now. "You seem upset about something." Patricia turned to look at me, and for just a moment, her carefully maintained facade slipped. I saw something in her eyes that looked almost like guilt, mixed with a determination that made my stomach clench. "Mia," she said slowly, "can I ask you something personal?" "Sure," I said, though everything about her demeanor was making me increasingly uncomfortable. "Do you love my son?" The question caught me completely off guard. "Of course I do," I said automatically. "Why would you ask that?" "Because," Patricia said, her voice taking on a harder edge, "I've been watching you for over a year now, and I've learned a lot about the kind of person you are." Something cold began spreading through my chest. "What do you mean?" Patricia reached into her purse and pulled out her phone, scrolling through what looked like photos. "I mean that I know about the men you've been seeing behind David's back. I know about the money you've been spending that you can't account for. I know about the lies you've been telling my son." My mouth fell open. "Patricia, what are you talking about? I haven't been seeing anyone else. I haven't been lying to David about anything." "Really?" Patricia held up her phone, showing me a photo that made my blood freeze. It was a picture of me having coffee with my friend Jake, a photographer I'd known since college who'd moved to Phoenix 6 months ago. We'd met up a few times to catch up and talk about potential collaboration on projects. The photo had been taken from across the street, and the angle made it look intimate in a way that was completely misleading. "That's my friend Jake," I said, my voice shaking. "We were discussing work. David knows about him." "Does he?" Patricia swiped to another photo, this one showing Jake walking me to my car and giving me a friendly hug goodbye. Again, the angle and distance made it look like something it wasn't. Because I asked David about Jake last week, and he had no idea who I was talking about. I stared at the photos, trying to understand how Patricia had taken them and why. "Have you been following me?" "I've been protecting my son," Patricia said, her voice cold and matter-of-fact. "David is too trusting, too willing to see the best in people. He doesn't recognize gold diggers and liars the way I do." "I'm not a gold digger," I said, my voice rising. "I have my own career, my own money. I've never asked David for anything." Patricia laughed, a sound completely devoid of warmth. "Please, you think I don't know about your financial situation? The student loans, the credit card debt, the fact that you're barely making ends meet with your little freelance projects? You saw David as a meal ticket, a way to upgrade your lifestyle." "That's not true," I said, but even as I spoke, I could see how my situation might look to someone determined to find fault. I did have student debt. I did sometimes struggle with irregular freelance income. David did often pay when we went out, though I'd tried to split expenses fairly. Here's what's going to happen. Patricia said, her voice taking on the tone of someone used to being obeyed. You're going to break up with David. Today, you're going to tell him that you realized you don't love him the way he deserves, that you want different things in life, and that you think it's better for both of you to end things now before anyone gets more hurt. I stared at her, unable to process what I was hearing. Are you insane? I'm not breaking up with David because of your paranoid fantasies. Patricia's expression hardened. Then I'll show him these photos, along with the bank records I've obtained showing your spending patterns, and the background check I had done that revealed some very interesting information about your past relationships and financial history. You had me investigated. The violation felt like a physical blow. You've been spying on me, following me, digging into my private life? I've been protecting my family, Patricia said simply, and I will continue to do whatever it takes to make sure my son doesn't make the biggest mistake of his life by tying himself to someone like you. I fumbled for the door handle, desperate to get away from this woman who'd pretended to care about me while systematically building a case against me. David will never believe this. He knows me. He knows I love him. David believes what I tell him to believe, Patricia said with chilling confidence. I raised him. I know exactly how to handle him. And if you don't do what I'm asking, I'll make sure he not only breaks up with you, but that he understands exactly what kind of person you really are. I managed to get out of the car, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold my keys. Patricia rolled down the passenger window and leaned out. You have until tonight, she called after me. End it cleanly, or I'll end it for you in a way that will make sure David never speaks to you again. I drove home in a daze, Patricia's words echoing in my head. The photos, taken out of context, did look damning. The financial information, viewed through the lens of suspicion, could be interpreted as evidence of ulterior motives. And the background check, whatever it contained, represented a level of invasion and manipulation that made me feel sick. But more than anything, I was terrified by Patricia's confidence that she could control David's perception of me. The certainty in her voice when she said David believed what she told him to believe suggested a level of influence that went far beyond normal maternal concern. I sat in my apartment, staring at my phone and trying to figure out what to do. I could call David and tell him everything, but would he believe me over his mother? I could refuse Patricia's ultimatum and let her show him whatever evidence she'd manufactured, but what if her manipulation was more effective than I thought? What if she really could turn him against me? For the first time since I'd met David Martinez, I began to understand that I wasn't just in love with him. I was in a war for him, against a woman who'd been planning my destruction from the moment we met, and I was losing before I even knew the battle had begun. I didn't break up with David that night. Instead, I did something that probably saved my life, though I wouldn't understand the full scope of it until much later. I called my friend Jake, the same Jake whose innocent coffee meetings had been twisted into evidence of my supposed infidelity, and asked him to meet me at a 24-hour diner in Central Phoenix. Jake listened to the entire story without interruption, his photographer's eye immediately understanding how the images Patricia had shown me could be manipulated to suggest something that never happened. When I finished talking, he leaned back in the worn vinyl booth and let out a low whistle. Maya, this is seriously messed up, he said, stirring sugar into his third cup of coffee. This woman has been stalking you, building some kind of dossier like you're a criminal. That's not normal protective mother behavior. But what if she's right about some of it? I asked, voicing the fear that had been eating at me all afternoon. What if I am taking advantage of David somehow? What if I'm not good enough for him? Jake reached across the table and grabbed my hands, forcing me to look at him. Stop. Right now, you're letting her get in your head, which is exactly what she wants. You know who you are. You know what your relationship with David is really like. Don't let some manipulative woman rewrite your story. But the photos, I started, are bullshit, Jake said firmly. Anyone with basic photography knowledge could make those look like whatever they wanted them to look like. Hell, I could probably make a photo of you buying groceries look like a drug deal if I wanted to. Something about his certainty helped quiet the panic that had been building in my chest all day. So what do? You tell David everything, Jake said without hesitation. Tonight, before she has a chance to get to him first with her version of events. I drove home with Jake's words echoing in my head, rehearsing different ways to explain to David that his mother had been spying on me, threatening me, trying to destroy our relationship. None of them sounded believable, even to me. How do you tell someone that the person who raised them, who they love and trust above almost anyone else, is actively working to sabotage their happiness? David was already home when I walked into our apartment, sitting on the couch with his laptop open, presumably catching up on work he'd missed during his long day of meetings. He looked up when I came in, and his smile was so warm and genuine that I felt tears spring to my eyes. "Hey, babe," he said, closing the laptop and patting the cushion beside him. "How was your day? Mom texted me that you gave her a ride to the doctor. That was sweet of you." I sat down next to him, my heart hammering. "David, we need to talk about your mother." Something in my tone must have alerted him, because his expression immediately became more serious. "What about her? Did something happen at the doctor's appointment?" I took a deep breath and launched into the story, starting with Patricia's car trouble that morning and ending with her ultimatum in the driveway. I told him about the photos, the financial investigation, the background check. I watched his face carefully as I spoke, looking for signs of belief or skepticism. David listened without interrupting, but I could see confusion and then concern growing in his expression. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Maya," he said carefully, "are you sure you understood what she was saying? Because this doesn't sound like my mother at all." "I know how it sounds," I said, reaching for his hand. "But David, she showed me the photos. She threatened to show them to you if I didn't break up with you tonight." David's brow furrowed. "What photos?" I explained about the pictures of Jake and me, how they'd been taken from a distance and made to look incriminating. David's expression grew more skeptical with each detail. "But Mia," he said slowly, "you never told me about meeting up with Jake. I had no idea you'd been seeing him." My stomach dropped. It wasn't a secret. We just grabbed coffee a few times to talk about work stuff. It didn't seem important enough to mention. "You've been meeting with another man regularly and didn't think it was worth mentioning to your boyfriend?" David's voice had taken on an edge I'd never heard before. "Not regularly," I said, panic creeping into my voice. "Maybe 3 times in 6 months. David, they were completely innocent meetings. Jake's a friend from college, nothing more." David stood up and began pacing, running his hands through his hair. "And my mother somehow knew about these meetings that you never told me about?" "She must have been following me," I said, though even to my own ears it sounded paranoid and unlikely. "Or," David said, turning to face me, "Jake told someone, word got back to her, and she was worried about you keeping secrets." I stared at him, realizing with growing horror that Patricia's plan was working exactly as she'd intended. By keeping my friendship with Jake casual and not worth mentioning, I'd inadvertently created the appearance of secrecy. David's natural trust in his mother was making him interpret my story as evidence of guilt rather than innocence. "David, please," I said, standing up and reaching for him. "You have to believe me. Your mother is trying to break us up. She's been planning this." David stepped back, avoiding my touch. "Why would she do that? What possible reason would my mother have for wanting to destroy my relationship with someone I love?" It was a fair question, and one I didn't have a good answer for. I'd never understood Patricia's motivations myself, just felt the growing intensity of her scrutiny and control. "I don't know," I admitted. "But David, she's been watching me, investigating me, taking pictures without my knowledge. That's not normal behavior." "You know what's not normal?" David's voice was rising now. "Accusing my mother, who's done nothing but welcome you into our family, of being some kind of stalker. You know what else isn't normal? Having secret meetings with other men and then getting angry when someone calls you out on it." "They weren't secret meetings," I shouted, my own voice finally rising to match his. "God, David, how can you not see what she's doing?" "What I see," David said coldly, "is my girlfriend making wild accusations against my mother because she got caught doing something she shouldn't have been doing." The betrayal in his voice cut through me like a knife. This was David. The man who'd spent hours helping me move furniture from a U-Haul. Who'd taught me to love the desert. Who'd made me feel like I belonged somewhere. And he was looking at me like I was a stranger, like I was the enemy. "Fine," I said, grabbing my purse and keys. "If that's what you think of me, then maybe Patricia was right about us." I walked out, slamming the door behind me, and drove aimlessly through Phoenix for hours, tears streaming down my face. I couldn't go back to my apartment, knowing David might come after me to continue the fight. I couldn't call my family, who were thousands of miles away and wouldn't understand the situation. I couldn't even call Jake again, since my friendship with him was apparently part of the problem. I ended up at an all-night Walmart, sitting in my car in the parking lot and trying to figure out what to do next. My phone buzzed with text messages, first from David asking where I was, then demanding that I come home so we could talk. Then, around 2 in the morning, a single message that made my blood run cold. It was from Patricia. "I told you what would happen if you didn't listen. David knows the truth about you now. Stay away from my family." I drove home as the sun was rising, exhausted and emotionally drained. David's car was gone from the parking lot, which I took as a small mercy. I needed time to think, to figure out how to fight back against Patricia's manipulation, to find a way to make David see what was really happening. But when I opened the door to our apartment, I found something that shattered my heart completely. David's clothes were gone from the closet. His books were missing from the shelves. His coffee mug, the one with the Arizona State University logo that he used every morning, was no longer in the kitchen cabinet. On the kitchen table was a note in David's handwriting. "Maya, I need some time to think about things. I'm staying at my mom's for a while. We'll talk when I'm ready." I sank into a chair and stared at the note, understanding that Patricia had won the first round completely. She'd driven a wedge between David and me, using nothing more than innocent photos and his own trust in her judgment. She'd made me look like the aggressor, the one making unreasonable accusations, while positioning herself as the concerned mother protecting her son from a deceptive girlfriend. For the next 3 days, I barely left the apartment. I called in sick to my freelance clients, surviving on delivery food and the growing certainty that my relationship with David was over. He didn't call or text. When I tried reaching out to him, my messages went unanswered. On the 4th day, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, a professional-sounding woman asked if I was Mia Chen. "This is Special Agent Sarah Rodriguez with the FBI," she said when I confirmed my identity. "I was wondering if you might have some time to meet with me today. I have some questions about Patricia Martinez." I nearly dropped the phone. "The FBI? What about Patricia?" "I'd rather discuss this in person," Agent Rodriguez said. "Would you be available to meet at our Phoenix field office this afternoon?" 2 hours later, I was sitting in a sterile conference room, staring at surveillance photos spread across a metal table. But these weren't photos of me having coffee with Jake. These were photos of Patricia Martinez entering and leaving various pawn shops, jewelry stores, and antique dealers throughout the Phoenix metropolitan area. "Mrs. Martinez has been under investigation for approximately 3 years," Agent Rodriguez explained, her voice calm and professional. "We believe she's been running a sophisticated stolen goods operation, taking items from homes where she has access, and selling them through a network of dealers who don't ask too many questions about provenance." I stared at the photos, my mind struggling to process this information. How does she have access to homes? "Various methods," Agent Rodriguez said. "She's worked as a house sitter, a caregiver for elderly clients, and she has relationships with people who trust her with their keys and alarm codes. She's very good at gaining people's confidence." Like she'd gained mine, I thought. Like she'd convinced me to trust her with details about my life, my schedule, my habits. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. Agent Rodriguez pulled out another photo, this one showing Patricia walking out of a pawn shop with a satisfied expression. "This was taken 2 days ago. We have reason to believe she recently acquired some particularly valuable items, possibly including antique jewelry that may have been stolen from a private residence." My heart stopped. What kind of antique jewelry? According to our sources, pieces that included jade, pearls, and what was described as a significant fire opal ring, Agent Rodriguez said, watching my face carefully. Do those items sound familiar to you? The room spun around me. Those were my grandmother's pieces. Patricia stole my grandmother's jewelry. Agent Rodriguez leaned forward. Can you tell me more about that? 3 months later, I watched Patricia Martinez being led away in handcuffs from the federal courthouse in downtown Phoenix. Her perfectly styled hair finally disheveled, her confident mask replaced by the hollow stare of someone whose entire world had just collapsed. The media was calling it the largest stolen goods operation in Arizona state history, with over 200 victims and nearly $3 million in recovered merchandise. I was victim number 47. The FBI had been watching Patricia for years, building their case slowly and methodically. What they hadn't expected was for one of her victims to walk into their field office with detailed information about her methods, her personality, and most importantly, her access to homes and personal information through the relationships she cultivated with unsuspecting families. When I told Agent Rodriguez about Patricia's systematic approach to gaining my trust, her questions about my schedule and finances, her unexpected visits to our apartment, everything clicked into place for the investigation. Patricia hadn't just been trying to break up David and me out of maternal protectiveness. She'd been studying me, learning my habits, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. The morning I left for Seattle to see my father, Patricia knew I'd be gone for at least a week. She knew David would be at work during the day. She knew exactly where I kept anything valuable, because she'd been in our apartment dozens of times, always with a plausible reason, always playing the role of the caring mother-in-law. What Patricia hadn't known was that the FBI had been tracking her movements for months, building a pattern of her activities that would eventually lead to her downfall. The pawn shop where she'd sold my grandmother's jewelry was under surveillance. The moment she walked in with pieces that matched the description I'd given them, they had her. The jade bracelet, the pearl earrings, and the fire opal ring were recovered, along with hundreds of other items Patricia had stolen over the years. Watches, necklaces, vintage collectibles, family heirlooms, all stored in a climate-controlled storage unit she'd rented under a false name. The FBI estimated she'd been running her operation for over 5 years, targeting people who trusted her with access to their homes and personal belongings. David called me the night of Patricia's arrest, his voice broken and barely recognizable. Maya, I'm so sorry. I'm so incredibly sorry. I was sitting in my apartment, holding the recovered jewelry box that Agent Rodriguez had returned to me that afternoon. The pieces were exactly as I remembered them, beautiful and untouched, but somehow the joy I'd felt when Dad first gave them to me was gone, replaced by a deep sadness for everything that had been lost. I know, I said simply, because there wasn't anything else to say. She played me completely. David continued, and I could hear tears in his voice. She made me doubt you, doubt us, doubt everything I thought I knew about the people I love. She's very good at manipulation, I said. Agent Rodriguez told me that's how she operated with all her victims. She gained their trust, made herself indispensable, then used that access to steal from them. David was quiet for a long moment. Can you forgive me? It was the question I'd been dreading and hoping for in equal measure. Could I forgive him for choosing his mother's word over mine? Could I forgive him for walking away when I needed him most? Could I forgive him for being so thoroughly manipulated that he'd made me question my own reality? I don't know, I said honestly. I understand why you believed her. She's your mother, she raised you, and she's apparently a criminal mastermind who fooled a lot of people. But David, you looked at me like I was the enemy. You made me feel like I was crazy for seeing what was really happening. I know, he whispered. I hate myself for it. We talked for over an hour that night, and many nights after. David moved back into our apartment, but things between us were different. The easy trust we'd built over 2 years had been shattered, not just by Patricia's manipulation, but by David's willingness to believe the worst about me when the pressure was applied. We tried couples counseling. We tried taking a vacation together, returning to some of the places where we'd been happiest during our early relationship. We tried pretending that we could go back to the way things were before Patricia inserted herself between us with surgical precision. But we couldn't. The damage was too deep. The betrayal too fundamental. 3 months after Patricia's arrest, David and I had the hardest conversation of my life. sitting on the same couch where he'd first accused me of lying about Jake, where I'd first tried to warn him about his mother's true nature. "I love you," David said, taking my hands in his. "I will always love you, but I don't think love is enough to fix what happened between us." "I know," I said, because I'd been thinking the same thing for weeks. "I love you too, but I can't forget how quickly you turned against me. And you can't forget that your mother is in federal prison partly because of information I gave the FBI." We held each other and cried that night, mourning not just our relationship, but the innocent trust we'd both lost in the process. David moved out the following weekend, and we began the complicated process of untangling 2 years of shared life. The hardest part wasn't dividing up furniture or deciding who got which kitchen appliances. The hardest part was accepting that sometimes love isn't enough when trust has been broken so completely. Patricia hadn't just stolen my grandmother's jewelry. She'd stolen our ability to believe in each other when it mattered most. 6 months later, I was offered a position with a design firm in Portland, the same city I'd left 3 years earlier to start over in Arizona. This time, I wasn't running from heartbreak, but toward something new, armed with hard-won wisdom about the difference between people who deserve your trust and people who exploit it. The night before I left Phoenix, I drove out to the desert preserve where David had first taught me to see beauty in the harsh landscape. I sat on a boulder as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in the same brilliant oranges and reds I'd seen in my grandmother's fire opal ring. I thought about Patricia, spending the first year of a 10-year federal sentence in a minimum security prison, her carefully constructed life in ruins. I thought about David, who'd called to wish me well but couldn't bring himself to see me off in person. I thought about the lesson I'd learned about how people can love you and still fail you when it matters most. But mostly, I thought about the future. About the design work waiting for me in Portland. About the friends who'd welcomed me back. About the possibility of loving someone new who would choose to believe in me, even when believing was difficult. As I drove back into the city for the last time, I touched the jade bracelet on my wrist, my grandmother's bracelet that had survived war and loss and theft to find its way back to me. Some things, I realized, are strong enough to endure even when everything around them falls apart. Patricia Martinez had tried to destroy my life, and in many ways, she'd succeeded in destroying the life I'd been living. But she hadn't destroyed me. I was still here, still standing, still capable of starting over with wisdom I'd paid dearly to acquire. Sometimes the most valuable thing you can steal from someone who's tried to break you is the knowledge that you're stronger than they ever imagined. And that knowledge, unlike jewelry or trust or love, can never be taken away once you've claimed it. I kept driving west toward my new life, my grandmother's ring catching the last light of the Arizona sunset, carrying with me the proof that some things are worth more than their weight in gold. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.